Cool. Can you all hear me?
Yes,
Awesome. Well, Matt can hear me, so that's good.
that's good
Awesome.
enough.
Thank you all so much for having me. I'm based in the United States, so not in London, although a bit of a funny story. I was actually in London kind of beginning of February, right when the pandemic struck. I got off of a plane and we got an email from one of our leaders at Google being like, okay, no more travel. And I was like, wait, I just got to London. How's this going to work? So I do love the city. I do have to admit Amsterdam is my favorite city, but London is a really close second. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'll tell you a little bit more about my background in a minute, but today what I wanted to talk about was there's this term DevOps. It's in the meetup. We saw 3 different definitions of it this morning, and Matt's kind of quick introduction. There's at least 100 that you can find with a quick Google search. And it seems like everyone's definition is a little bit different. So my goal here is not to try to come up with some super concrete definition, but to tell you what DevOps isn't, or some common myths of DevOps, so you can better understand the ways that you can adopt this in your organization, or the way that you can change your way of thinking to better match what the word was intended to mean when it was initially kind of said out loud. So my name's Seth. I work at Google. I'm an engineer at Google. I've been at Google for just under 3 years now. Prior to that, I worked at HashiCorp. They make Vagrant Packer, Surf Console, Terraform, Nomad, and Auto. I was there for 4.5 years. I was employee number 4 there. And before that, I actually worked at Chef Software. So the company that makes, my slide, there we go. Before that, I was at Chef Software, which is the company that makes Chef, the automation tool. I actually worked there when it was called Opscode. And then before that, I worked at a company called Custom Ink, which is based in the United States. They're kind of you can go online, design a t-shirt, and get it printed all digitally online, custom t-shirts. The reason for the work history is that I have been involved in like this DevOps infrastructure as code, little bit of security space since like late 2011 or early 2012. So it's been 8-ish years. If you count that in pandemic years, it's 460. So I've been around the block a bit, and I'm pretty familiar with the DevOps, the evolution of DevOps, as well as the original intended meaning. And I personally know some of the folks who have been credited with coining the term, folks like Patrick and John Allspaw, who were largely some of the first people to ever say the word DevOps publicly on a stage or in a publication. So with that, I'm going to jump into some of these myths, and I'm going to leave some time at the end for some questions. So don't if you disagree with them, please let me know. So what's the first one? This is arguably the most contentious one. There's no such thing as a DevOps engineer. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I imagine there are people on this call who have that job title though, or some derivative of that, right? DevOps solutions architect, DevOps engineer, site reliability engineer. But there actually is no such thing as a DevOps engineer. And I'll explain a little bit more about this in a second, but when we actually look at the definition of DevOps, this job description doesn't make sense. But before we get into that, we need to talk about hype cycles. So whenever we look at anything, right, not just a word or a technology pattern, but like anything in the world, it tends to follow a hype cycle. This is like Gartner's hype cycle, but there's a bunch of different hype cycles. But there's generally like a triggering event, a period of inflated expectations where people think that this new technology or this new paradigm is going to be a panacea, it's going to solve all their problems. Then we move into like the trough of disillusionment where people are like, wait a minute, it didn't solve all my problems, this must be terrible. And then we gradually like hit the slope of enlightenment and we plateau towards productivity. And none of this is new or my research, but if we imagine DevOps kind of moving along this pattern, I think we've definitely kind of hit inflated expectations. I think we've definitely hit the trough of disillusionment. And I think we're currently sitting in the slope of enlightenment world. with a little bit of an unclear way of how to get over that last hump to move on to the plateau of productivity. So what does this actually mean? So if you search Google for air quotes LinkedIn DevOps, you'll get over 27 million results. This is a slightly older screenshot. I did it yesterday and it was closer to 38 million. In 0.45 seconds, that whole Google search thing is really fast. But you'll get millions and millions of results, right? Like 20 plus millions of results for DevOps. And look at all those job things, right? 19,000 DevOps engineering jobs, 23,000 DevOps jobs. Yet when you do that same exact Google search for a little bit less glamorous of a term, like sysadmin, you only get 1 million search results, significantly less, right? Like 20 times, 30 times less orders of magnitude. So like, why is there this massive disparity between DevOps, which is a relatively new term, and systems administration, or sysadmin, which is a relatively older term that generally describes people who build and manage and maintain complex computer systems? Is the hype over? And all of this is to like provide you some background information that everyone thinks of DevOps differently. Some people think of DevOps as a role. Some people think of DevOps as a cultural movement. Some people think of DevOps as a thing that you add to your title to get a 10,000 pound raise. There's many different ways to look at DevOps. And it's my goal here throughout this talk to show you kind of the more Puritan definition of DevOps. I'm not trying to convince you that I'm right. I'm just trying to give you some kind of historical evidence as to how we got along this movement. So my definition of DevOps is actually very straightforward. DevOps is 2 or more organizational units working together toward a common success criteria. And you'll notice that there's no mention of cloud, there's no mention of technology, there's no mention of computers or software or Ruby or Python or Node.js, right? This is just 2 or more organizational units, 2 or more groups within an organization working together towards a common success criteria. So what is all the buzz about? Well, a lot of organizations mistake operations for DevOps. They mistake things like traditional systems administration or cloud architecture or cloud orchestration with DevOps. So if we go back to that original definition, 2 or more organizational units working together towards a common success criteria, and we asked ourselves, if this is the definition, what is a DevOps engineer? Well, a DevOps engineer would be someone who's responsible for ensuring that 2 or more organizational units communicate and work well with one another. And it turns out we already have this role. We call these people managers, right? They already exist. This is already a well-defined job function. So for this reason, like, I don't actually believe that there is a concept of a DevOps engineer. I believe that we have people who are doing work that is closely tied to DevOps, right? We have people who are doing cloud architecture, people who are doing automation, people who are investing in systems administration. But I think it's unfair to call them DevOps engineers because they're not actually doing the collaboration and communication part as their function of their job. It's tangentially related because of the other work that they're doing. So what's the second myth? The second myth is probably my favorite one, which is that DevOps is the panacea for all of your problems. Like I said, I've been in the industry for quite a long time, and I've heard many customers say like, oh, we just need to put more DevOps into it. Like they use DevOps as like a noun where you have like a quantity of DevOps. I'm going to reach into my DevOps bank and pull out 5 DevOps. It's not like a quantity of something that you can buy and use. You know, to give you a concrete water cooler example here, it's like, oh, production went down again. We just need to do better DevOps. And that actually doesn't make sense. Improving your collaboration and communication isn't going to prevent production from going down again. Improving collaboration and communication is a good step in identifying the problems that caused production to go down and then mitigating them again in the future. But you're not going to solve that problem with DevOps. So To give you a little bit more context, I'm going to tell you like a little bit of a short story. Very early on in my career, I was in my first job and I was looking for my second job. So I was interviewing for places, and I interviewed for a company that was seeking someone to fill this DevOps position. Like, it was on a job posting as a DevOps architect or DevOps engineer. And throughout the interview, they were asking me for a lot of advice. And in turn, I asked them a lot of questions, like, what does this role entail? What does this look like? And it turned out that all of the things that they needed were satisfied by someone who fulfills a traditional operations role. This organization had no on-call, right? They had no software like PagerDuty. They had no ability to page people when systems were down. They had no way of knowing when systems were down because there was no monitoring, there was no logging, there was no alerting. And the developers just kind of did whatever they wanted. They had a plethora of programming languages and some microservices and some monoliths and very different frameworks. And this is back in like 2013. So like Kubernetes wasn't quite as popular yet. So they had, virtual machines and bare metal, and things were just all over the place. And what I realized throughout this interview is that they didn't have a DevOps problem. They had an operations problem. And I actually told the hiring manager, I was like, I don't think that I'm the right person for this role, because what you actually need is someone who can be a systems administrator or an operations manager who can get all of these things in order and teach you how to productionize your systems. I can come in and teach you all of the DevOps principles, but at the end of the day, the organization needs to be willing to make that change. So what's the third myth? This one's pretty contentious. You can be certified in DevOps. Now, I bet there are people on the call who have certifications from Amazon or Google or Azure or third parties that offer DevOps certification. However, I don't actually believe in that. Because if we go back to my definition earlier, with DevOps just being breaking down barriers between two people and increasing collaboration, the exam would be very simple. If you've attended and passed with a C or better, either the first or second grade of elementary or primary school, you would pass the DevOps certification exam, because early stage primary school focuses, pretty heavily on the collaboration aspect of working with others and, sharing your Play-Doh so that you don't, and don't put that gum in that person's hair. Like, all of these things are part of DevOps. So you would easily ace that exam. However, what happens? Like, why are we in this world where if you attended primary school, you have all of the qualifications you need to properly participate in DevOps, but then we have this entire movement where we had to convince large organizations and governments that this DevOps thing, that this collaboration was actually something good. I have a theory that the only difference between first grade and our industry, the technology industry, is the size and relative cost of the toys that we get to play with, right? Thomas the Tank Train is like, I don't know, 20 US dollars, right? A mainframe is like 20 million US dollars. But at the end of the day, the only difference between first grade and our industry is the size and the cost of the toys that we get to play with. So then that begs the question, when and where did we lose the desire and willingness to work with others, right? Because in like primary school, like, it's all about playtime, right? I want to go to recess. I want to play with my cars. I want to play with my Barbies. I want to build something. I want to do arts and crafts. I have all of this desire to be creative. But where did that go, right? I'm now 20, 30, 40, 50. I've been in the industry for a long time. How did we lose that desire and willingness to work with others? Well, in elementary or primary education, there's this big focus on collaboration, right? Work in groups, break up into groups, go get your partner, work together in sports teams and school projects. There's this heavy emphasis on collaboration and teamwork. However, as we move towards secondary and post-secondary education, that completely changes. Secondary and post-secondary education is highly focused on the individual. And you can see the difference in these two photos, right? In the first photo, we have a big focus on team collaboration. They're punching the ball around the pole. And then the second one, like the desks are organized in such a way that you can't look over your shoulder to cheat, right? And we put this huge emphasis on cheating and the emphasis of the individual. In secondary and post-secondary education, we're actively discouraged from working with other people. It's all about us, we're stack ranked, and we're kind of forced to get away from that inner creativity and collaboration because high school and college squash us into these isolated boxes of self-efficiency. And in those boxes, we're often quantified and ranked by some standardized testing or ranking that encourages unhealthy competition, right? Like if you're first in your class, you get extra money when you graduate, or you get better job opportunities. And all of this leads to a world in which we don't actually want to work with other people anymore, because it's all about us being the best, because that's what we're incentivized to do by the institutional systems that we're surrounded with. But DevOps is all about communication, collaboration, and sharing ideas. So my answer to like, hey, you can be certified in DevOps is pretty straightforward. If you need a certificate to say that you play well with others, I think you have bigger problems than a bullet point on your resume. That doesn't mean things like cloud certifications and particular software certifications are useless. I actually think they're very useful, all the way dating back to like CCNA and networking level certifications. But when we're specifically talking about DevOps, the idea that you know how to collaborate with other people isn't something that you should have to flaunt. Like it should be a requirement in order for you to gain a particular role, because collaboration and communication is essential for any successful role. So now let's get on to some of the more direct ones. DevOps is using Chef, Puppet, Ansible, Salt, Terraform, Jenkins, Spinnaker, Kubernetes, Nomad, right? The list goes on and on and on and on. What this myth is saying is that DevOps is about using particular tools or technologies. And this one's actually a little bit harder to separate, because many of the original pioneers of DevOps came from the configuration management and infrastructure as code spaces. So it can easily appear, or I guess backing up, the same people who are getting on stages and doing webinars like these saying like, you should do DevOps, are also the same people who created a lot of these tools, right? Like folks like Adam Jacob, folks like John Allspaw, folks like Patrick Dubois, Nathan Harvey. All of these folks came from kind of the configuration management infrastructure as code world. So it's very easy to see that, oh, when one of those people get on the stage, then you have to be using the tools that they're associated with in order to be doing DevOps. But that's actually not true, right? It might appear that way, but there's actually no affiliation, right? So DevOps is not affiliated with a particular company or a particular technology. In fact, you can adopt DevOps practices in a tiny little startup all the way up to a massive large enterprise. You can adopt DevOps using mainframe technologies all the way up to the most advanced Kubernetes scheduling setup that you can imagine. It's not affiliated with any company or technology or architecture. DevOps is just for engineers and operators. This is a really big myth that is a little bit of a true and false at the same time. When DevOps was initially created, it was actually just between engineers and operators. DevOps was designed and developed to break down the barriers that existed between the people who run software and the people who have to write that software. So engineers, the people writing the software, would write the software, they would throw it over a wall to the operators, the people who have to maintain that software. There wasn't a lot of collaboration, there were some power dynamics there. So at its very basis, DevOps was about breaking down those barriers. But while DevOps originally proposed to bridge the gap between engineers and operators, what we've learned, right, because things do evolve, is that DevOps principles extend far beyond the concept of engineering. So whereas you may think like, oh, we have, our organization is structured like this, right? We have development, we have operations, and then everything else. And we think like, oh, well, we'll just break down the barriers that exist between development and operations. We'll have a DevOps team underneath all of this, right? So we'll just create this DevOps team that handles all of the collaboration between development and operations, and the collaboration between development and sales and marketing, and the collaboration between operations and the management and the leadership team. And like, we know that this doesn't work. There's a ton of research from the DevOps Research Assessment, the DORA team, a ton of third-party research that shows that creating a DevOps team doesn't actually solve this problem. Because again, going back to the earlier statement, creating a DevOps team is creating a team of people who tell you that you need to work better with others. And that's not actually productive. DevOps instead needs to be unilaterally applied across the entire organization. So instead of creating a DevOps team, we have to interlay DevOps principles everywhere. We have to interlay DevOps principles and culture between development, operations, sales, marketing, QA. All of that are incredibly important, both within their own little microcosm, but overall within the global context of the organization. Another myth, I don't know what number we're on, but another myth is that DevOps is about going to conferences and meetups. So this is awkward, right? Like we're at a meetup right now. And I'm telling you that you don't have to go to meetups and conferences in order to learn about DevOps. But I'll preface this by saying, like, I organized a DevOps conference. I was one of the organizers of DevOps Days Pittsburgh a few years ago. I know many of the folks who are part of the Global DevOps Days organization, which is like the kind of global franchise. These things, right, like meetups and conferences and user groups, these are all great ways to network and to expand your education. But there's no requirement that you go to meetups or conferences in order to start learning how to adopt DevOps in your organization. So, like, in my opinion, DevOps Days are like the best environment for learning and collaboration. Going to a meetup is a great way to meet the community and understand how they're evolving. It's also a great recruiting tactic as you're trying to grow your team and grow your skill set. But at the end of the day, organizations can implement DevOps without ever attending a conference or going to a meetup or sitting on a webinar. So I think it's easier and faster for organizations to participate in these communities, but you don't actually have to participate in the community in order to adopt the outcomes of that community. But you should still go to some DevOps conferences and keep going to DevOps meetups because they're really good. The next one is that DevOps is using the cloud. This one is fun because similar to the configuration management story, DevOps evolved at a very similar time to where cloud was evolving, right? The concept of cloud computing. But before we talk about that, it's important to recognize that when we say the cloud, everyone has a slightly different perspective of what the cloud actually means, right? To a user, this is what the cloud is. Like all of your data is in the cloud. Is it cumulonimbus? Is it Stratus? I don't know. To a more technical user, right, this is the cloud, right? It's things like Google Drive, things like an S3 bucket. I don't know, I like Handwave, but I like kind of understand it, right? To a developer or an like this is the cloud, right? It's just like a giant plethora of these beautiful servers that are laid out, and they all look the same and act the same, and it's just this wonderful place where you have an infinite amount of compute and an infinite amount of RAM to do all of your processing. And then to an operator, this is the cloud. It's just this collection of arduous fiber cables and connections and failovers and SATA drives and power redundancy. So when we talk about the cloud, there's actually a lot of different ways that we can look at it. When we look at the cloud as an expansion of your computing power, then it's great. When we look at the cloud as an expansion of the complexity in your stack, it's not so positive. And that's often how we get contention, because some people look at the cloud as capability and some people look at as complexity. And balancing that capability and complexity is incredibly important. I won't show it here because we're running a little bit short on time, but at Google, we made a video a few years ago called the Google Cloud Platform Actual Cloud, in which we highlighted kind of an April Fool's joke of what would it be like if you ran a data center in an actual cloud. And it's not real, like it's all fake, but because it was for an April Fool's joke, but it's pretty entertaining, and it does do a little bit of eye-opening of like, what would happen if we actually put your data in the stratosphere? So going back to the myth, like a public cloud, private cloud, or even virtualization isn't a requirement to implement DevOps. Like I said earlier, you can adopt DevOps using a mainframe. You don't need any of this. It certainly helps, right? But that's not a requirement, because even mainframe operators can still practice these DevOps principles. And there's a lot of organizations that are doing this successfully. So another myth is that DevOps is the same thing as Google or Netflix or GitHub or Twitter, right? And I say this as like I work for one of those companies. We often aspire to the achievements of the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitters, the GitHubs of the world, but sometimes we fail to acknowledge that they might be solving a different problem. Have the strategies that they've chosen allowed them to be successful, or have they allowed them to be successful in the situations that they're solving? I'm going to throw some things at you that are incredibly ridiculous. We should use Rails because GitHub did. We should write our monitoring service in Node.js because that's what Etsy did. We should use PHP because that's what Facebook did. And then we should rewrite all of PHP because it wasn't fast enough for us. We should start with a Rails app and then migrate to a high distributed multi-tiered Scala app based on service-oriented architecture because that's what Twitter did. All of these should sound crazy because doing something because another company did it isn't a rational business decision. Now, we can learn from these opportunities, right? There's a reason that at Google, we publish all of the books on site reliability engineering, secure and reliable systems, our software engineering book. And all of those are us telling the world how we build secure systems, how we run and operate software at scale. It's your job to read those books and then distill the information that's relevant to your industry and your organization. You should never look at something and be like, oh, we should do what that company does because we think it's a good thing. You should look at something and say, we should do what that company does because they had a very similar problem and this solution solved it. Try your best not to like idolize particular organizations or companies because they may be solving problems in a very different way from you. DevOps is about doing ultimately what's best for your organization in your industry and your employees. Another myth, DevOps is using new technology like Node or Ruby or Go instead of old technology like C or Scheme or Java. We've kind of already talked about this a little bit, but the type or maturity of your technology stack doesn't matter. It really frustrates me anytime I hear someone be like, oh, we need to rewrite this in a different language so we can move faster. That actually is always a false dichotomy, right? The ability to move quickly is independent from the language, especially now that we have like containerization technology. But even before that, it was still possible to move quickly regardless of a language. Usually what you actually mean when you say, oh, we can't move quickly because it's written in Java and the JVM takes too long to start up. It means that no one has invested the time to improve the startup time of the application. It doesn't mean that the technology choice was bad. It means that the architecture is currently flawed. That's my timer to remind me to shut up, but we're almost done. Enterprises are often left out of the DevOps conversation. And this has changed recently, but in the early days, it felt like DevOps was only for startups and like small businesses. Big organizations are left behind because not because they can't, but because they don't understand that they can. You can adopt these practices at massive scale. It just takes leadership and commitment to say that this is a change that we want to have happen. And there are many organizations out there, massive, large enterprises that have successfully undergone a DevOps transformation. DevOps is just a fad, like Agile or mainframes. So mainframes were a data center technology. Agile was a programming methodology. And DevOps is an organizational ideology. Technologies tend to change. Methodologies definitely evolve. But ideologies tend to remain at least a lot longer. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, it's this. DevOps is a way to facilitate organizational prosperity and growth. That all sounds pretty awesome to me. There are definitely some misconceptions around what DevOps is and what DevOps isn't and how it can be adopted. But at the end of the day, what we should be doing is we should be doing the thing that's best for our organization, best for the people in that organization, and best for our customers who are consuming the service, whether that's an internal customer or some external customer that you're providing a service to. So with that, I'll stop. Like I said at the beginning, my name's Seth. My Twitter handle is in the very bottom right there. It's been on every slide. Feel free to tweet at me. I don't know if we actually have time for questions because I know I went a little bit over, so I'll defer to Matt.
Seth, thank you very much. That was excellent. Thank you.
Well done, Seth.
Sorry, you have to take us clapping as a substitute for the other 193 people. Yes, we do have a little bit of time for questions. So some people have been putting some questions in the Q&A. So I'll take a couple, probably the simpler ones for me to read out for you. So we've got a question from Dushyant, who's saying, if we wanted somebody to enforce DevOps values and principles using technology, what should we call that? I think that's going back to the myth about DevOps engineer not being a job title. If that person is working to make product development delivery smoother and faster, what would you call that designation?
Engineer, right? Like if someone is actually doing engineering work, right? They're building processes. If that person is, say, making the CI/CD process seamless and very low friction, I might say that they're a release engineer. If that person is helping automate the security scanning of all of the applications and services so that security review can go faster, I would say that they're a security engineer, right? I think it depends on the context of the work that they're doing to make that development and delivery smoother, right? There's so many pieces that go into development besides the code. There's security, there's privacy, there's legal, there's UI, there's UX, right? There's all of these components. So depending on which part they're optimizing, I think that's where they would sit within the org. And like even within Google, we have like a core systems organization that kind of builds the underlying systems that all of our things are built on top of. But they're still just engineers.
Awesome, thank you, Seth. So just one more question from Tom. Oh, it's just moved on my screen. Where is it? There it is. So it seems like non-tech companies with digital ambitions, they seek validation from the decision of FANG-like companies. I think FANG is like Google and Facebook and Apple. Don't know what the N is anyway. Does the Netflix, thank you. Does the technical capability need to start from the top? So this is in reaction to like, don't just copy all of these companies, I think.
Does the technical capability need to come from the top? So I personally believe that anyone is capable of becoming an engineer, given enough training and on-the-job experience. I do think that in order for an organization to like successfully lead, in order for an organization to do this transformation, they do need someone to lead that transformation. And it'll be a much easier experience and have a higher probability of succeeding if the person leading that transformation has the technical expertise and is informed about the value proposition and the various trade-offs. That doesn't mean that person has to come from like FANG, right? But I think someone who's well-informed and well-read is a good enough. But I think someone who's experienced it is definitely going to provide an advantage.
Fabulous, thank you, Seth. Just time for one more from Dan. Do you see a future where the term DevOps has got less variation across the community?
No, and honestly, I think we're talking about it a little bit less. This could just be my own selection bias because everyone is at home, but even before the outbreak, I feel like we've latched on to SRE now as like the new buzzword that seems to be going around. And one of the advantages of SRE is that it has a very well-defined thing because it was announced in a book that defines what it is and has somewhat obtuse, but also very strict criterion around what it is. And I actually, my colleague and I, former colleague and I, Liz, did a whole video series on like the difference between DevOps and SRE and the similarities between them. But I don't ever see a world in which every human being agrees on the definition of DevOps. I do see a world in which we stop arguing about it. Hopefully that answers your question.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so once again, thank you so much for joining us, Seth. Thank you for coming on. Really enjoyed the talk and seeing lots of great feedback. in the chat. Things like outstanding presentation, really refreshing and insightful. I'll be quoting from this in the morning. It's like brilliant stuff. So thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you.